Obviously, it's a well-organized effort, and this is the 10th year?
12th year.
The 12th year. Yeah. So, mashallah, yani that's a sign of its success. And of course, the attendance that I saw is another sign of the people's interest in coming to the conference.
Well, it then gives me very great pleasure to introduce His Royal Highness Prince Turki Al Faisal. He's the former ambassador for Saudi Arabia to both the United Kingdom and the United States. He is one of the founders and a trustee of the King Faisal Foundation, one of the largest philanthropic foundations in the world, and his humanitarian activities extend further with his role as a trustee of the International Crisis Group and a commissioner of the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. His Royal Highness is also chairman of the board of the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies in Riyadh. Your Royal Highness, it is a great pleasure to have you with us.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أفضل المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Ladies and gentlemen, first I thank the Dean of the London Business School, Professor Sir Andrew Lickerman, and Nasser Al-Mutairi of the Middle East Club of the London Business School for inviting me to address such a distinguished audience. And I remember fondly my first encounter with the school when I was ambassador here, attending the conference in that year. Saudi Arabia now stands as a premier economy in the Middle East, and by extension, it continues to grow in importance vis-à-vis the larger global political, energy, and economic outlook. As such, I shall outline the kingdom's place in the Middle East and North Africa region in general, as well as make comparisons between the kingdom and other important nations, very much in the forefront of recent discussions about rising economic powers. It is my hope that by looking closely at Saudi Arabia's political and economic situation, that you will come to see just how successful the kingdom has been at securing a healthy, stable, and vibrant position of preeminence in the landscape of the Middle East and beyond. Of course, when speaking of the Saudi economic picture, it is most pertinent to begin with energy. Currently, Saudi Arabia, as you know, possesses nearly 25% of the world's proven oil reserves and is the world's largest producer and exporter of petroleum. The kingdom currently produces about 10 million barrels per day and has a spare production capacity of about 2 million barrels per day, nearly 90% of the global total capacity available. This spare production capacity is the result of dozens of years of hard work and careful planning and tens of billions of dollars in investment in Saudi oil infrastructure. And it is palpable proof and undeniable evidence of Saudi Arabia's long-term interest in a stable and secure oil market. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has a strong record of political stability, fiscal responsibility, and economic diversification. We have become an important provider of petrochemicals and financial services in our region, leading to the accumulation of over $800 billion in foreign reserves amassed during King Abdullah's rule. This figure sets Saudi Arabia as the third largest holder of foreign reserves behind China and Japan. Though with a population much smaller than these two countries, the kingdom is the largest foreign reserves holder on a per capita basis within the G20. The result is that the Saudi government has been able to spend hundreds of billions of dollars in the last several years to build universities, schools, hospitals, railroads, airports, and housing developments. In 2011, King Abdullah announced a financial amelioration package of over $150 billion in extra expenditures that benefited the poor, provided housing assistance, and supported a real estate fund and bank of credit. Another program raised the salaries of public employees and military personnel and instituted a minimum wage, as well as giving part-time public sector employees full employment and benefits. King Abdullah also instituted unemployment benefits across the board. One of Saudi Arabia's main objectives is a business environment that is healthy and welcoming to growth. In fact, the World Bank's listing of the most competitive economies ranked Saudi Arabia as 11th most business-friendly nation in the world. This position places the kingdom far above any of the BRIC nations, all of which rank relatively lower in comparison to Saudi Arabia. Further, in a recent Bank of America Merrill Lynch report on the long-term growth outlook for the European, Middle Eastern, and African regions, Saudi Arabia was one of the 3 nations listed as having the greatest growth potential. One reason for these top rankings is the amount that Saudi Arabia spends on education in comparison to these other nations. Currently, Saudi Arabia spends over 30% of its budget on education, as well as technical and vocational training. This spending has not only been on primary, secondary, and high school education, but on institutions of higher learning, which Saudi Arabia continues to build at a pace and scale far beyond most other countries within the G20 grouping, such as the King Abdullah University for Science and Technology. Furthermore, Saudi Arabia has arguably the world's largest government-sponsored foreign scholarship program in the world. The King Abdullah Foreign Scholarship Program has currently enrolled over 120,000 Saudi students, allowing them to pursue undergraduate, graduate, and doctoral degrees at universities across the globe. This program costs about $8 billion every year and is another reminder of the commitment the Saudi leadership has shown toward the well-being of the future generations of Saudis, on which the continued prosperity and development of the kingdom will depend. 2 weeks ago, the king added an 80 billion rial endowment for the benefit of primary, secondary, and high school education. It will go to improve the curriculum, enhance extracurricular activity, raise athletic standards, and elevate the quality of teachers. Clearly, with its consistent political stability, predominant energy reserves, and eminent position in the Arab world, Saudi Arabia stands in a leadership position in the region. Stability is the paramount reason for the kingdom's ability to continue to grow and help foster prosperity around the world. In these complex times of political instability and economic dislocation across the world, the people of Saudi Arabia continue to support their government's policies. But it is when one looks at the economic health and size of Saudi Arabia that the true picture emerges of just how pivotal the kingdom is to the Middle East, North Africa region. The total 2014 IMF projected GDP of the entire Middle East, North Africa region is $3.27 trillion. Saudi Arabia's projected 2014 GDP of $772.6 billion therefore represents 23.6% of the total GDP and 27% of the Arab world's economic output. Clearly, relative to its size, Saudi Arabia holds a considerable position in the overall economic scene in the Middle East and North Africa region. Turning to the political changes that have occurred and are still occurring in a host of Arab nations, the kingdom views them all in the same way. It is the will of the people of each country that determines who should lead them. Tunisia, the land from which the so-called Arab Spring first erupted, and excuse the mixed metaphors here, is still struggling to find the right balance for its nascent polity. In Egypt, the past 3 years have proved to be difficult and bloody transition. The roadmap that the people approved by a large majority still has to run its course. A dedicated terrorist campaign by the discredited Muslim Brotherhood continues to try to disrupt the roadmap, but its efforts will face the inevitable failure that resulted the last time that terrorists unleashed their bloody acts against the Egyptian people in the last decade of the previous century. And we have just had the results of the presidential election showing how the roadmap is being implemented. But both countries, economies, and political systems will continue to face challenges. Civil war in Libya and escalating violence in Yemen have caused tens of thousands of lives and set back economic development by decades, and the situation in both nations remains highly unpredictable. The situation in Bahrain seems to have stabilized for the time being, but problems could flare up again. In Syria, a society now sits on the edge of an abyss of nightmarish internecine warfare that is spilling into Lebanon, Turkey, and Iraq. The Syrian tragedy, ladies and gentlemen, poses a moral test for a world that maintains an unbelievable disregard for the suffering of the people at the hands of a butchering clique that knows no bounds to its cruelty. Innocent civilians standing in queues at bakeries are the frequent targets of fire barrels invented by Assad's henchmen, especially to wreak havoc on the people. After trying to reason with Assad at the beginning of the mass demonstrations without success, the kingdom took the diplomatic route. The Arab League, at the kingdom's urging, proposed the formation of an interim government with full authority to be composed of the opposition and the regime. The proposal was presented to the UN Security Council, but the Russian and Chinese leadership's vetoes scuttled it. The Russian leadership went further by continuing to supply Assad with the lethal arms and advice that allow him to continue killing his people. Even the proposal recently presented to the Security Council to authorize the International Criminal Court to begin investigating whether crimes against humanity by whomsoever have been committed has been vetoed by the Russian and Chinese leaderships. Assad, having literally gotten away with murder, is now using chlorine gas, which is not deemed to be a chemical weapon, but which is as lethal as the other gases. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards are not only fighting on the ground with Assad's troops, but they have also recruited Hezbollah from Lebanon and other Shia militias from Iraq to continue the slaughter. Syria is a festering wound, which collects all of the worst bacteria from around the world. So-called Sunni jihadist terrorists, even from this country, are wreaking havoc in the areas which they dominate. The irony is that the genuine, legitimate, and moderate opposition, which Saudi Arabia would like to see supplied with defensive weapons to deny Assad the use of his air force and tanks, but which the West continues to deny them, is now fighting both Assad's forces and their allies from the Shia militias on one side, and the so-called Sunni jihadists, Al-Qaeda fighters, and other bloodthirsty irregulars on the other. This is a shameful situation and a dark blot on the moral standing of the world. While these tragic conditions are of relatively recent emergence, several older storms have been raging for some time, and their outcomes appear equally difficult to determine. Among these, and intimately linked with the difficulties many Arab states are now facing, is the case of the ambitions of the Iranian leadership. There are troubling issues with Iran's leadership: their ambition to acquire nuclear weapons, their occupation of the 3 islands of the United Arab Republic, and their persistent meddling in the affairs of Arab nations. As for the issue of nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia continues to support the creation of a zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. But the zone must have 2 conditions. First, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council must provide a nuclear security umbrella for the zone. This will meet Israel's fear of being threatened by a nuclear-armed enemy, although we all know that Israel already has nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction. Second, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council must guarantee that they will sanction any country of the zone seen to be developing weapons of mass destruction with not only economic and political sanctions, but also with military sanctions. This is clearly what is best for the future of the people of Iran and the region. And to convince the Iranian leadership of this path, we fully support the tightening of sanctions, assertive diplomacy, and concerted action via the United Nations. The Kingdom has welcomed the interim agreement reached by the P5+1 and Iran, but we reserve our applause until we see the final agreement. On the second issue, that of Iran's occupation of the Emirati Islands, we support the UAE's position and have urged Iranian leaders to accept a ruling from the International Court of Justice. On the third issue, that of Iran's inserting itself into the domestic politics of Arab countries, there can be no flexibility. The Iranian leaders must stop attempting to influence the direction that other governments take by funding entities such as Hezbollah and non-state actors like the Houthis, the Molotov cocktail throwers in Bahrain, and various Shia militias in Iraq. As Saudi Arabia looks out at Iran and considers what is to come in the next decade, it can only hope that the people of that nation will encourage their leaders to take a wiser and safer route than the one they now seem bent upon traveling, much to the detriment of themselves and others. The Saudi government is still trying to convince the Iranian leadership of the error of their ways. The Saudi foreign minister invited the Iranian foreign minister to visit the kingdom since the election of President Rouhani. However, he hasn't yet come. In Iraq, the situation remains uncertain. The rate of those killed in terrorist acts has exceeded the rate from the years 2005 and 2007. The present government is narrowly based on sectarian divides, and the influence of Iran is clearly present. If the recent election there is considered democratic, then it gives democracy a bad name. Another storm of far longer gestation than the recent uprisings, a situation that lies at the center of so many difficulties faced by our region, is the plight of the Palestinian people. As former US President Jimmy Carter has repeatedly said, the persecution of the Palestinians under the occupation forces is one of the worst examples of human rights deprivation. And while many similar claims and counterclaims have been expressed on this issue, the path to peace is clear. King Abdullah's forthright Arab Peace Initiative of 2002 laid the groundwork for an end to hostilities. If the Israelis withdraw from occupied lands, including East Jerusalem, to their pre-June 4th, 1967 boundaries, and address the refugee situation through mutual agreement, Saudi Arabia and the other Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation will commence normal and peaceful relations with the State of Israel. And on the all-important issue of Palestinian statehood, Saudi Arabia fully supports an official UN declaration recognizing the State of Palestine and believes that Palestinian statehood is not a matter of if, but a matter of when. Finally, when it comes to difficulties facing our region, one must still admit that terrorism remains an important threat. But it is not just Al-Qaeda that continues to plot against us. There are also various emerging and re-emerging non-state actors who are moving in to take advantage of power vacuums created by shifting political dynamics. With governance in Libya, Yemen, Iraq, Egypt, and Syria in such tenuous conditions, the perfect conditions for terrorist cells to take root and conduct desperate, evil, and anarchical acts are created. Having rooted out the terrorist threat from within its borders, Saudi Arabia continues to work with its allies, wherever it can find them, to stamp out this scourge of nihilists who feel it is their right to visit heinous violence upon others in the name of false and destructive ends. All of these storms, Arab nations facing turmoil and violence, the Iranian leaders' regional aggressiveness, the continuing Israeli aggression against Palestine and its people, and the creation and exploitation of terrorist enclaves share a common thread in that they breed instability and insecurity in the region. And it is exactly for these reasons, economic development, prosperity, and stability, that Saudi Arabia has taken such an active leadership role in the Middle East and the Muslim world. At an economic level, Saudi Arabia is nearly alone in providing significant investment and development aid into its neighboring economies, something that has become increasingly important in the past several years as various governments and societies have faced challenges of instability and upheaval. For example, since the beginning of 2012, the Kingdom has announced aid packages of well over $40 billion to strategic allies in the Arab world and the wider Muslim community of nations. These strategic aid packages are being disbursed to each of the countries in need with the objective that this critical assistance will help those nations transition smoothly out of their current state of turmoil. The foreign workers in the kingdom repatriate over $12 billion to their families in their countries every year, providing sustenance to those families and much sought-after hard currency to the exchequers of their governments. Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, Yemen, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the Philippines, Vietnam, Nepal, Indonesia, all of these countries benefit from these remittances. And that's why Saudi Arabia has such a long and lavish history of sharing its wealth with others and working with other countries to help them achieve the kind of prosperity now common in the kingdom. It is the practice very much based on something that my grandfather used to say: a man is not rich if his neighbors are poor. Ladies and gentlemen, the kingdom still faces internal challenges. Our youthful population is described by so-called experts as a threat to our stability. I regard our youth, however, as a boon to push forward our development with their enthusiasm and vigor. Having the educational, vocational, and technical training programs instituted by the government, which I mentioned before, our youth will fill the jobs that are being created by the vast development projects also mentioned before. Only the lazy and infirm will not find work in the kingdom. Our women pose another challenge. The government has opened all fields of work for them, and yet there are still those among our people who oppose the right of women to work. This social impediment will take time to overcome, but having enfranchised women to vote in and be elected in our electoral system, and having women occupy 20% of the Shura Council is a strong incentive to achieve the full rights of women in our society. Their added contribution to the workforce and political participation will further quicken the pace of development and progress. In conclusion, I say to you that we are truly all neighbors now. The digital revolution, with its social media tools, has shrunk the world. So may we, in the spirit of good neighbors, all continue to work together to our mutual success. Thank you very much. Thank you.